The Reich's thousand-year dream was crumbling to dust in the spring of 1945. As Soviet artillery pounded the outskirts of Berlin, the once proud capital of Hitler's Germany had been transformed into a necropolis of shattered buildings and broken spirits. The magnificent boulevards designed by Albert Speer to showcase Nazi power now served as channels for the Red Army's vengeful advance. For the soldiers and civilians trapped inside this concrete tomb, the countdown to annihilation had begun. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. In the early hours of April 16, 1945, the largest artillery barrage in history illuminated the eastern approaches to Berlin. Over 40,000 Soviet guns and rocket launchers unleashed a hellish symphony across a narrow front. The ground trembled for miles as shells rained down at a rate of 250 per minute. German positions along the Oder and Neisse rivers disintegrated under this apocalyptic bombardment. Within this cauldron of fire, the Third Reich's final defensive line began to melt away. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, had methodically positioned his forces for this decisive moment. At 50 years of age, the stocky, battle-hardened commander carried the full weight of Stalin's expectations. Failure was not an option. The race to Berlin against his rival, Marshal Ivan Konev of the First Ukrainian Front, had political implications that extended far beyond military considerations. The first Soviet marshal to plant the red banner on the Reichstag would earn Stalin's favor, and in Stalin's inner circle, such recognition often meant the difference between life and death. 500 miles to the west, American and British forces had halted their advance at the Elbe River. Political calculations had trumped military momentum. Despite possessing the capability to reach Berlin before the Soviets, General Eisenhower had decided against it. The Americans calculated that capturing Berlin would cost them 100,000 casualties for a prize that would ultimately fall within the Soviet occupation zone, according to the Yalta agreements. This fateful decision sealed the destiny of both Berlin and its inhabitants. Inside the doomed city, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' voice crackled through radios in bunkers and cellars. The Führer is in Berlin. His genius and determination will turn this battle into the greatest victory in our history. The reality, however, could not have been more different. In the Führer bunker, 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, Adolf Hitler moved wooden battalions that no longer existed across maps, planning counteroffensives with phantom armies. The physical and mental deterioration of the German dictator mirrored that of his crumbling empire. The defense of Berlin had been entrusted to General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula. A methodical and experienced defensive specialist, Heinrici recognized the hopelessness of the situation. His forces consisted of approximately 45,000 regular army troops, supplemented by 40,000 Volkssturm, old men and boys hastily conscripted in a desperate last measure. Against them stood over 2.5 million Soviet troops, 6,150 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. A juggernaut of vengeance fueled by 4 years of bitter struggle on the Eastern Front. Heinrici had deployed his meager forces with tactical acumen. Instead of defending directly on the Oder riverbank, where Soviet artillery could destroy them, he positioned his main defensive line on the Seelow Heights, the last natural barrier before Berlin. This ridge of hills rising 150 feet above the surrounding floodplain offered the Germans their final chance to halt the Soviet advance. Heinrici had also ordered the deliberate flooding of the Oder Valley by opening nearby reservoir dams, creating a swampy morass intended to slow the Soviet armor. In Moscow, Stalin summoned Zhukov and Konev on April 1, 1945. The dictator drew a line on the map dividing the approaches to Berlin between their respective fronts. To Konev's delight, Stalin's pencil drifted northward into Zhukov's sector as it approached the city. The message was clear. This was a competition, and whoever reached Berlin first might claim the prize. Stalin's manufactured rivalry between his marshals would cost thousands of lives as caution was sacrificed for speed. The first waves of Zhukov's assault troops crossed the Oder under cover of darkness on April 16th. Soviet infantry struggled through the waterlogged ground while German defenders poured fire from fortified positions on the heights above. The initial Soviet advance moved at a crawl, barely 2 kilometers by nightfall, far short of Zhukov's expectations. Frustrated by the delay and pressured by Stalin's demands for rapid progress, Zhukov made a fateful decision. He ordered his tanks forward to lead the assault across the flooded terrain toward the Silo Heights. It was a disastrous miscalculation. Soviet T-34 tanks bogged down in the muddy ground, creating perfect targets for German anti-tank guns. By daybreak on April 17th, hundreds of Soviet tanks lay burning across the floodplain. German defensive positions had been carefully prepared with overlapping fields of fire. Every hedgerow, farmhouse, and hillock concealed machine gun nests, anti-tank weapons, or snipers. Even teenagers manning these positions could inflict devastating casualties on the advancing Soviets. Obergefreiter, Corporal Karl-Heinz Kästner of the 9th Parachute Division, described the scene in his diary. "The Russians came on like ants, wave after wave. We fired until our barrels melted. Each time we thought it was over, another line would emerge from the smoke. I have seen war for 4 years, but nothing like this. This is not fighting, it is slaughter, and we are the butchers and the butchered at once." Despite these temporary successes, the German defenders faced insurmountable odds. By April 18th, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers began to tell. The Silo Heights were breached in multiple locations as Konev's forces made rapid progress in the south, threatening to encircle the German units still fighting on the heights. Heinrici requested permission to withdraw the remaining forces to prevent their encirclement. Hitler's response was unequivocal: not one step back. Trapped between impossible orders and certain destruction, many German units made the decision to retreat toward Berlin anyway. Those who remained loyal to Hitler's directive were quickly surrounded and destroyed. By April 19th, the road to Berlin lay open. Soviet forward units had advanced to the eastern suburbs of the city. The final battle for the Nazi capital was about to begin. Inside Berlin, the civilian population faced the approaching catastrophe with a mixture of dread and resignation. Nearly 4 million people had called the city home before the war. By April 1945, approximately 2.7 million remained. Those with means or connections had fled westward. Those who stayed faced the terrible choice between surrender to the Soviets or continued resistance in an obviously lost cause. Propaganda had done its work well. For years, Germans had been fed a steady diet of anti-Bolshevik horror stories. Some were exaggerations, many were not. As the Red Army advanced through East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania in early 1945, reports of atrocities, particularly mass rapes, confirmed the worst fears. In many cases, Soviet troops took revenge for the unimaginable brutality that German forces had inflicted during their invasion of the Soviet Union. An estimated 25 million Soviet citizens had perished since 1941. Now that accumulated suffering fueled a terrible retribution. 16-year-old Lothar Löwe, drafted into the Volkssturm, recalled the atmosphere. "We were told the Russians would kill everyone. We believed it. Even my mother, who hated the Nazis, believed it. She gave me her wedding ring to trade for food or ammunition and said, 'Fight as long as you can, then shoot yourself. Don't let them take you alive.' This was the advice of a mother to her only son." As Soviet forces approached, Berlin's defenses were hastily organized into 8 concentric sectors. The outer defensive ring utilized the Bundesautobahn beltway surrounding the city. 3 defensive lines were prepared within the city itself, with the final perimeter encompassing the government district and the Führerbunker. Hitler appointed SS General Karl Weidling, commander of the LVI Panzer Corps, as the battle commander of Berlin on April 23rd. It was a dubious honor. Just days earlier, Hitler had ordered Weidling's execution for supposedly withdrawing his corps without orders, a misunderstanding that was clarified just in time. The city's defensive force was a hodgepodge of regular Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS formations, Hitler Youth, police battalions, and Volkssturm. Among the most fanatical defenders were the foreign SS volunteers, particularly French, Norwegian, and Danish units of the Nordland Division who had nowhere to go and no hope of mercy if captured. Some fought out of genuine ideological conviction, others simply to postpone the inevitable. Berlin itself had been transformed into a fortress of desperation. Subway tunnels were flooded to slow the Soviet advance. The grand boulevard of Unter den Linden was blocked with overturned trolleys and rubble barricades. Anti-aircraft towers, massive concrete fortresses built to protect against Allied bombing raids, were repurposed as ground defensive positions. The massive flak towers at the Berlin Zoo and Humboldtine Park became fortresses within the fortress. Their 128 mm anti-aircraft guns lowered to fire directly at advancing Soviet armor. When the Soviets reached the city limits on April 21st, they faced a formidable urban battlefield. Every building could conceal snipers, every intersection had been mined, every approach covered by interlocking fields of fire. The Germans had 3 years of experience defending cities on the Eastern Front from Stalingrad to Budapest. They had learned that urban terrain negated Soviet advantages in armor and air power. Street by street, house by house, room by room, the battle would be reduced to its most primal form. Marshal Zhukov designated 8 avenues of advance converging on the city center like spokes on a wheel. Each avenue was assigned to a different Soviet corps. The strategy was simple: maintain constant pressure on all fronts, prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces, and gradually compress the perimeter until it collapsed. The Soviets understood that urban warfare favored the defender, but they had a solution: overwhelming firepower. The artillery tactics employed by the Red Army in Berlin were brutally effective. Rather than leveling entire blocks, Soviet gunners targeted specific buildings with precision fire. The standard procedure was to destroy the upper floors first, driving the defenders downward. Then the ground floor would be destroyed, forcing the Germans into the cellar. Finally, flamethrower teams would clear the cellar. Against this methodical destruction, there was little effective defense. Soviet tanks advanced in small groups, usually accompanied by infantry riding on their decks. This combined arms approach had been perfected through bitter experience. When German defenders managed to separate the Soviet infantry from their tanks, usually by targeting the first and last vehicle in a column to trap the rest, they could achieve temporary success. But there were always more Soviet tanks, more Soviet infantry. On April 22nd, Hitler performed his last significant military act by splitting the defense of Berlin between 2 competing commands. The SS General Felix Steiner was ordered to attack the northern Soviet flank with forces that existed largely in Hitler's imagination, while General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, still intact and fighting the Americans near the Elbe, was commanded to disengage and march to Berlin's relief. These desperate orders reflected Hitler's detachment from reality. Neither attack materialized in any meaningful way. By April 25th, Soviet forces had penetrated deep into Berlin's defensive rings. From the east, Zhukov's forces had fought their way through the working-class districts of Marsan, Weissensee, and Pankow. From the south, Konev's troops had captured Tempelhof Airport and were advancing through Neukölln and Kreuzberg. Most significantly, the Soviet Fifth Shock Army had reached the Landwehr Canal, the last major water barrier before the government district. That same day, Soviet forces from Zhukov's and Konev's fronts met at Potsdam, completing the encirclement of Berlin. Any hope of escape for the defenders or the civilian population was extinguished. Far to the west, American and Soviet forces linked up at Torgau on the Elbe River, an event celebrated in the Western press as Victory Day. For those trapped in Berlin, however, the worst was yet to come. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler's mental state oscillated between delusional optimism and bitter despair. He continued to move non-existent divisions across his maps, ordering counterattacks with forces that had been destroyed days or weeks earlier. Occasionally, reality would pierce the fog. On April 22nd, when informed that Steiner's counterattack had not materialized, Hitler suffered a breakdown, admitting for the first time that the war was lost. Yet he refused to consider surrender, condemning everyone in Berlin, soldiers and civilians alike, to continued pointless suffering. Those officers who suggested capitulation were met with hysterical accusations of cowardice or treason. Several committed suicide rather than face Hitler's wrath or participate in what they recognized as senseless slaughter. Others, particularly the SS and Nazi Party officials, had no choice but to fight to the end, knowing that surrender meant certain death. For the foreign SS volunteers and the Hitler Youth, fanaticism often replaced tactical judgment. They launched suicidal counterattacks that achieved nothing but extending their own agony. One of the most tragic aspects of Berlin's final days was the deployment of child soldiers. Hitler Youth members, as young as 12, manned anti-tank positions, armed with Panzerfaust rocket launchers. With minimal training but maximum indoctrination, these children could destroy a Soviet tank if they got close enough, which many did, at the cost of their lives. Soviet tankers, recognizing the threat these child soldiers posed, showed them no mercy. Hans-Georg Henke, a 16-year-old Luftwaffe helper, described the situation. "We were positioned in the Wilhelmstrasse with a Panzerfaust each. Our orders were to let the Russian tanks pass, then shoot them from behind in the engine compartment. I watched my friend Werner try this. The tank turret swiveled and fired. There was nothing left of Werner. I dropped my weapon and ran." They called this strategy sacrificing yourself for the fatherland. I called it murder. As the perimeter contracted, civilians packed into cellars and subway stations sought protection from both the bombardment and the advancing Soviet troops. Water systems had failed weeks earlier. Electricity was sporadic at best. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Parents gave their children sleeping pills to quiet their hunger pangs. Hospital staff performed amputations without anesthetics. The wounded were left where they fell. There were no resources to treat them, no safe evacuation routes. The psychological torment of waiting for the end was often worse than the physical deprivation. Women cut their hair short, smeared their faces with ash, and dressed in shapeless clothing to appear unattractive to the Soviet soldiers they would inevitably encounter. Many families made suicide pacts. Cyanide capsules became valuable currency in the final days, a means of escaping a fate perceived as worse than death. By April the 26th, Soviet forces had reached the Tiergarten, Berlin's Central Park. The massive government buildings along the Wilhelmstrasse were now directly threatened. The Reichstag, the symbolic heart of German political power, stood less than a kilometer from the Soviet forward positions. Stalin had ordered that the Soviet flag must fly over this building for May Day propaganda photographs. This political directive added urgency to an already intense battle. The Tiergarten itself was no longer the verdant park shown in pre-war postcards. Years of bombing had stripped the trees to jagged stumps. The once green expanse had been transformed into a moonscape of shell craters. Anti-aircraft guns had been positioned throughout the park, their high-velocity fire adding to the cacophony of destruction. Many of these guns were now manned by teenage girls from the auxiliary services, their youth and gender no protection against Soviet vengeance. As Soviet forces converged on the city center, the brutality of the fighting intensified. Quarter was neither asked nor given. Building by building, the Soviets employed the tactics they had mastered in Stalingrad, but now with overwhelming numerical superiority. Heavy artillery, including 200 mm howitzers, fired directly into buildings at point-blank range. The signature weapon of this urban nightmare was the Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun, its high rate of fire ideal for room-clearing operations. For the surviving German defenders, ammunition and food were running critically short. Radio communication between isolated pockets of resistance had broken down. Each building, each street, fought its own private war, unaware of the situation even a few blocks away. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. Some units heard that Hitler was dead, others that a relief force was hours away. Some commanders maintained discipline to the end, others abandoned their men to save themselves. In the government district, SS units fought with particular desperation. Many were foreign volunteers from the Nordland Division, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes who had cast their lot with Nazi Germany and now faced annihilation. Their commander, SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg, had been appointed to defend the central sector on April 24th. A veteran of the First World War and a former diplomat, Krukenberg was under no illusions about the outcome, but was determined to fulfill his oath to the bitter end. The Reichstag itself was defended by a mixture of regular army troops, SS men, and naval personnel who had been stranded in Berlin when their ports were overrun. The massive Neo-Renaissance building had been gutted by fire in 1933 and subsequently damaged by Allied bombing, but its thick walls and labyrinthine interior made it an ideal defensive position. The Soviets would pay a heavy price for this symbolic prize. Across the Königsplatz from the Reichstag stood the imposing bulk of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's official residence. Its long underground bunker complex housed not only the Führer, but the remaining Nazi leadership, a government in name only, controlling little more than the few blocks surrounding them. From this subterranean command post, Hitler continued to issue increasingly divorced from reality, even as Soviet shells impacted the gardens above. On April 28th, news reached Berlin that Himmler, the dreaded SS chief, had attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Hitler was enraged by this betrayal from his most loyal henchman. In his paranoid state, he now suspected everyone of treachery. The next day, he received confirmation that Mussolini had been executed by Italian partisans and his body publicly desecrated in Milan. The message was clear. This would be Hitler's fate if captured. That same day, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. Immediately afterward, he dictated his political testament, a rambling document blaming Germany's defeat on international Jewry and the treachery of his generals. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, perhaps believing that the Navy was the only service that had not betrayed him. Then, with Soviet troops less than a kilometer away, Hitler prepared for his final act. Above ground, the battle for the Reichstag had reached its climax. On April 30th, Soviet soldiers fought their way into the building's massive interior. The combat degenerated into a savage hand-to-hand struggle in smoke-filled corridors and rubble-strewn chambers, grenades, bayonets, entrenching tools. Anything that could kill was employed in the darkness. By evening, despite pockets of resistance continuing to fight on the upper floors, Soviet soldiers Mikhail Yegorov and Meleton Kantaria raised the red banner on the Reichstag roof. The iconic photograph of this moment would become one of the most recognizable images of the war, though it was actually a staged reenactment taken the following day. As this symbolic victory was achieved, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, shooting himself while simultaneously biting on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took poison. Following Hitler's previous instructions, their bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The charred remains were hastily buried in a shell crater. German radio maintained silence about Hitler's death for a day, then announced that he had fallen fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism. The truth would not be confirmed to the wider world for months. Hitler's suicide did not end the battle for Berlin. Joseph Goebbels, appointed chancellor in Hitler's testament, made a half-hearted attempt to negotiate a ceasefire with the Soviets. When this was rejected, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children, then took their own lives. General Hans Krebs, the last chief of the German General Staff, attempted to negotiate with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, but was authorized only to discuss surrender terms, not surrender itself. The meeting ended in failure. The fighting continued. For the ordinary German soldiers and civilians still alive in the shrinking pocket, Hitler's death changed nothing. The Soviet advance ground inexorably forward, building by building. Atrocities mounted on both sides. Fanatical SS units executed anyone they found attempting to surrender or displaying white flags. Soviet troops, often fueled by alcohol distributed before assaults, engaged in widespread looting and sexual violence. Military discipline on both sides had disintegrated in the apocalyptic environment. In the western districts, General Weidling still commanded organized resistance from his headquarters in the Bendler Block. On May 1st, with ammunition exhausted and his forces reduced to isolated pockets, he made the decision that Hitler had refused to make. He ordered all remaining troops to cease resistance. At 6:00 a.m. on May 2nd, Weidling surrendered to the Soviets. Small groups of SS men, especially foreign volunteers with nothing to lose, continued fighting for another day, but organized resistance had ended. As dawn broke on May the 2nd, an eerie silence fell over Berlin for the first time in weeks. The constant artillery bombardment, the crack of small arms fire, the rumble of tank engines, all had ceased. In their place came new sounds, the wails of women, the shouts of Soviet soldiers celebrating victory, the dull thud of buildings weakened by battle collapsing under their own weight. The battle was over. The occupation had begun. For the civilians emerging from their shelters, the nightmare was not over. Despite orders from the Soviet High Command to treat the population correctly, discipline among frontline troops was often non-existent. The first wave of Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal combat and driven by revenge for German atrocities in their homeland, engaged in an orgy of violence. Rape was widespread and systematic. Women of all ages, from young girls to elderly widows, were victimized repeatedly. Many committed suicide rather than endure continued abuse. The second echelon of Soviet troops, which arrived days later, was under better discipline. The worst excesses gradually diminished as military police units established control. NKVD detachments began systematic arrests of Nazi Party members and suspected war criminals. For many Berlin residents, however, the damage had been done, physical, psychological, and moral trauma that would never fully heal. The human cost of the battle for Berlin was staggering. Estimated Soviet casualties were between 80,000 and 100,000 killed, with twice that number wounded. German military deaths are harder to calculate, but likely exceeded 50,000, with civilian casualties estimated between 30,000 and 50,000, many being suicide victims. These figures, while enormous, tell only part of the story. The battle represented not just a military defeat, but the complete collapse of a society built on the twisted ideology of National Socialism. As May 1945 progressed, Berlin's surviving population faced immediate concerns of survival. Food was critically scarce. Infrastructure had been destroyed. Dead bodies lay unburied in the streets and beneath the rubble. Disease threatened to claim those who had survived the battle. The Soviet authorities, now responsible for this devastated city, faced an enormous humanitarian challenge alongside their political and military objectives. For the victorious Soviets, the capture of Berlin represented the culmination of a 4-year struggle for national survival. From the gates of Moscow in 1941 to the heart of the Nazi capital in 1945, the Red Army had fought the largest land war in human history. The cost? Over 8 million Soviet military dead and perhaps 18 million civilian casualties, was beyond comprehension. Berlin was their prize, their revenge, and their validation. Marshal Zhukov, who had opened the German-Soviet War by confronting the initial Nazi onslaught in 1941, now stood triumphant in Berlin. His rivalry with Konev forgotten in the flush of victory, Zhukov was the conquering hero, the face of Soviet military success. On May 8th, he formally accepted the German instrument of unconditional surrender on behalf of the Soviet High Command. The war in Europe was officially over, yet even as the guns fell silent, the seeds of the next conflict were being sown. Berlin, like Germany itself, would soon be divided between the victorious Allies. The Soviet sector of Berlin would become a communist enclave deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. The city that had been the epicenter of one totalitarian regime would become the front line of another ideological battle, the Cold War. For 16 years, until the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the city would serve as an escape route for those fleeing communist rule. The battle for Berlin had ended, but the struggle for Germany's soul was just beginning. For Hitler's former allies who had fought alongside Germans in Berlin, the foreign SS volunteers, the Italian fascist units, the collaborators from occupied territories, the future offered only harsh judgment. Many were executed after hasty trials. Others faced long imprisonment. Some managed to disappear into the chaos of post-war Europe, assuming new identities and escaping justice. The moral complexity of their choices, whether motivated by genuine ideological conviction, opportunism, or coercion, would be debated by historians for decades. The physical destruction of Berlin was near total. 70% of the city lay in ruins. Of 245,000 buildings, only 91,000 remained habitable. The transportation system had ceased to function. Water and sewage systems had collapsed. Electric power was available for only a few hours per day, if at all. Industrial production had stopped entirely. The city that had been one of Europe's great capitals now resembled a lunar landscape of rubble mountains and skeletal structures. The reconstruction of Berlin would take decades. The famous Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, became an iconic image of post-war Germany, women of all ages forming human chains to clear debris brick by brick. Their work was both practical and symbolic, representing the first step toward rebuilding not just a city, but a nation's identity. Yet the psychological rebuilding would take far longer than the physical reconstruction. For the Soviet soldiers who had fought their way from Stalingrad to Berlin, victory brought a complex mixture of emotions. Elation at survival, pride in achievement, relief that the killing had ended, but also for many, shame at the excesses committed during the final battle. Years of brutal combat and relentless propaganda had dehumanized the enemy. When confronted with the reality of German suffering, particularly among women and children, some experienced a crisis of conscience that would haunt them for decades. Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Gelfand wrote in his diary on May 6, 1945, "I walk among these ruins and cannot feel the hatred I carried for 4 years. I see old women searching for food who remind me of my grandmother. I see children afraid to look at my uniform who could be my younger brothers. Yesterday we were trying to kill each other. Today I give them my rations. What sense can be made of this?" The fate of German prisoners taken during the battle varied dramatically. Those fortunate enough to be processed through official channels faced years of harsh captivity, but at least had a chance of eventual repatriation. Others simply disappeared into the vast Soviet Gulag system, their families never learning their fate. Some, particularly SS members identified by the distinctive blood-type tattoo, were executed immediately. Of the approximately 90,000 Germans captured during the battle, it is estimated that only about 5,000 survived to return to Germany. Among those captured was General Weidling, the city's final defender. Imprisoned in the Soviet Union, he died in Vladimir Prison in 1955, reportedly of heart failure. Whether his death was natural or assisted remains unknown. Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann, who had witnessed Hitler's final days and confirmed his suicide, managed to escape Berlin but was captured by the Soviets in December 1945. Remarkably, he survived imprisonment and returned to West Germany, where he lived until 1996, largely avoiding public attention. The highest-ranking Nazi captured in Berlin was Hans Fritzsche, head of the radio division in Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Tried at Nuremberg as a substitute for the dead Goebbels, Fritzsche was one of only 3 defendants acquitted. His testimony provided valuable insights into the final days in the Führer bunker. Later denazification proceedings resulted in his classification as a lesser offender, allowing him to rebuild a modest career in West Germany before his death from cancer in 1953. For the ordinary German soldiers who had survived the battle, many of them teenagers with only weeks of training, the experience would define their lives. Horst Grundmann, a 17-year-old conscript who had been placed in a Panzerfaust anti-tank unit, recalled, "We went from being the master race to being nothing in a matter of days. My entire education had taught me German superiority was a scientific fact. When I saw our vaunted technology being crushed by endless waves of Soviet tanks, my world collapsed before my eyes." The survivors carried not only physical scars but profound psychological trauma. Many suffered what would now be recognized as PTSD, but was then dismissed as weakness or cowardice. West German society, rebuilding with American assistance under the Marshall Plan, had little patience for those who dwelled on the past. East Germany, recast as a socialist state under Soviet control, mandated a collective amnesia about certain aspects of the war, while emphasizing others that served the new regime's narrative. Both German states developed distinct methods of processing the Nazi past. In West Germany, the economic miracle of the 1950s provided a convenient distraction from moral introspection. Individual responsibility was often subsumed under the concept of collective guilt. In East Germany, the state embraced anti-fascism as its founding principle, while conveniently ignoring the role of ordinary Germans in supporting the Nazi regime. Neither approach fully addressed the complexities of individual choice and responsibility. The Berlin battlefield itself became divided by the emerging Cold War. The Brandenburg Gate, which had witnessed some of the fiercest fighting of the battle's final days, became a symbol of division, standing just inside East Berlin, visible but unreachable from the west. The Reichstag, where Soviet soldiers had planted their victory flag, sat in ruins in West Berlin, deliberately left unrestored as a reminder of Germany's dark past. Not until after reunification in 1990 would it be rebuilt as the seat of a democratic German parliament. The most tangible legacy of the battle was the division of the city itself. Berlin became an island of Western presence deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. The 4 sectors, American, British, French, and Soviet, initially allowed free movement between them. This arrangement created an escape valve for those fleeing communist rule, as East Germans could simply walk into West Berlin and claim asylum. By 1961, this hemorrhage of population led to the construction of the Berlin Wall, physically embodying the Iron Curtain that Churchill had described in 1946. The political consequences of Berlin's fall extended far beyond Germany. The Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe, validated by their capture of Berlin, created a new geopolitical reality that would dominate the next 4 decades. The United States and its allies, having allowed the Soviets to take Berlin for military expedience, soon found themselves in a global confrontation with their former ally. Berlin, divided and traumatized, became the most visible symbol of this new Cold War. For the civilian survivors of the battle, life continued in a profoundly altered landscape. Food shortages persisted for years. The black market became the primary economy. Women vastly outnumbered men, a demographic imbalance that would characterize German society for a generation. Many children had lost one or both parents. Schools had been destroyed, both physically and as institutions. The educational system that had indoctrinated a generation with Nazi ideology had to be completely rebuilt. Marta Hillers, who anonymously published her diary, A Woman in Berlin, documenting her experiences during the Soviet conquest, wrote, "We are now a city of women. We clear the rubble. We queue for bread. We carry water from pumps 2 kilometers away. The men who return are shadows, physically broken, spiritually defeated. They cannot look us in the eye, knowing what happened to us in those final weeks, and we cannot tell them for fear of what it would do to whatever remains of their manhood. The psychological impact of mass sexual violence during the battle's final phase created a collective trauma that remained largely unaddressed for decades. In East Germany, the topic was taboo. Soviet soldiers were officially liberators, not rapists. In West Germany, the suffering of German women was often viewed through the lens of collective guilt, a terrible but perhaps deserved retribution for German crimes in the East. Not until the 1990s would historians and society begin to address this aspect of the battle honestly. Children born of these assaults faced particular challenges. Neither fully German nor Russian, they were visible reminders of a trauma many wished to forget. The exact number of such children is unknown, but estimates range from 10,000 to 100,000 across all Soviet-occupied territories. Their stories of stigmatization, identity crises, and search for acceptance represent one of the battle's most enduring human legacies. The environmental impact of the battle for Berlin was equally profound. The intense artillery bombardment not only destroyed buildings, but contaminated soil with lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals. Unexploded ordnance remained a hazard for decades. As recently as 2014, construction workers in central Berlin uncovered a 1,000-pound Soviet aircraft bomb that required evacuation of thousands to defuse. The city's water table was polluted with chemicals from ruptured industrial sites and fuel from thousands of destroyed vehicles. The ecological cost of those few weeks of combat would be measured in decades of remediation efforts. Berlin's fall represented not just the military defeat of Nazi Germany, but the total collapse of an ideology that had claimed to establish a 1,000-year Reich. Just 12 years after Hitler's appointment as chancellor, his self-proclaimed master race lay utterly defeated, his capital in ruins, and his own corpse burned to ashes in a shell crater. The speed and completeness of this collapse has few parallels in history. For those who had invested their faith in Nazi promises of German supremacy, the psychological shock was profound. The battle itself has been studied extensively by military historians as the culmination of Soviet deep battle doctrine, a concept developed in the 1930s by Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky before he fell victim to Stalin's purges. The encirclement of Berlin, the use of multiple axes of advance, the coordination of combined arms, the concentration of overwhelming force at decisive points, all reflected sophisticated operational art that had evolved through 4 years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. For the Western Allies, who observed the fall of Berlin from a distance, the battle offered troubling insights into Soviet military capabilities. The Red Army that emerged from World War II was the largest and most experienced fighting force in history. Its ability to coordinate massive operations involving millions of men and thousands of tanks demonstrated organizational skills that worried Western military planners. The battle for Berlin helped shape NATO's strategy throughout the Cold War, as Western forces prepared to face what they had witnessed in April 1945. The battle's political aftermath extended well beyond military considerations. The Soviets quickly established control systems in their occupation zone, installing German communists who had spent the war years in Moscow. Walter Ulbricht, who would later lead East Germany for decades, arrived in Berlin on April 30, 1945, the very day of Hitler's suicide, with a cadre of trusted communists known as the Ulbricht Group. Their mission was to establish Soviet-friendly administrative structures before any spontaneous democratic movements could emerge from the chaos. In the Western sectors, a different approach prevailed. Initial denazification efforts aimed to remove Nazi party members from positions of influence. In practice, however, practical necessities soon trumped ideological purity. Many former Nazi bureaucrats and officials found their expertise was still required to make the machinery of government function. This pragmatic compromise would later cause soul-searching about the incomplete reckoning with Germany's Nazi past. For Jews who had survived the Holocaust, Berlin represented both the heart of the machinery that had sought their destruction and, paradoxically, a potential place of return. Before Hitler, Berlin had been home to one of Europe's most vibrant Jewish communities. By 1945, that community had been all but exterminated. Of the few who did return to Berlin after liberation from camps or hiding places, many found they could not remain in a city filled with so many ghosts. The magnificent new synagogue on Oranienburger Strasse, once the center of Berlin Jewish life, stood as a burned-out shell, a physical embodiment of all that had been lost. The Battle of Berlin also marked a turning point in warfare itself. It was the last major urban battle fought without concern for the city's cultural heritage or civilian infrastructure. Future conflicts would be shaped by greater media scrutiny and evolving legal frameworks governing urban combat. The total war approach employed by both sides in Berlin, where victory at any cost was the only consideration, represented the culmination of a particularly brutal era in military history. For military planners worldwide, Berlin provided sobering lessons about urban combat. The battle demonstrated that even a defeated and desperately outmatched defender could extract a terrible price from attacking forces in a major city. Urban terrain negates many technological advantages, reduces the effectiveness of air power and heavy weapons, and compresses combat to its most primitive form. These lessons would influence military doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond, as armies developed specialized training and equipment for urban operations. The human stories that emerged from Berlin's fall reveal the complex moral choices faced by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Some risked their lives to protect others, hiding Jews until liberation, sheltering women from sexual violence, sharing scarce food with strangers. Others succumbed to barbarism, participating in last-minute executions of defeatists or denouncing neighbors to prove their continued loyalty to a dead regime. Most existed in a gray area between these extremes, making compromises necessary for survival while trying to maintain some semblance of humanity. Major Gerda Berndt of the German Red Cross remained at her post in a makeshift hospital in the Schultheiss brewery cellars throughout the battle. With no electricity, minimal medical supplies, and hundreds of wounded, she performed amputations by candlelight using carpenter's saws sterilized with schnapps. When Soviet troops arrived, she stood at the entrance, refusing them entry until they provided a medical officer who would respect the neutrality of a medical facility. Remarkably, her authority was recognized, and the wounded under her care were treated as medical cases rather than prisoners. After the war, she was allowed to continue her medical career in East Germany, one of the few former German officers permitted to maintain their professional status. Such individual stories of moral courage, amidst the collapse of civilized norms, provide counterpoints to the overall brutality of the battle. They remind us that even in the darkest moments of human history, individual agency remains. Choices can be made that affirm rather than deny our common humanity. These exceptions to the general rule of brutality are perhaps more significant for their rarity. The final toll of the Battle of Berlin extends far beyond the immediate casualties. The battle represented the culmination of a conflict that had claimed over 50 million lives worldwide, the deadliest in human history. It brought to an end a regime responsible for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi racial ideology. It completed the destruction of a German society that had embraced or at least accommodated this ideology. And it set the stage for a new geopolitical conflict that would dominate the next half-century. For those who fought in Berlin, whether German or Soviet, the experience remained the defining moment of their lives. Veterans on both sides often found themselves unable to communicate the reality of those weeks to those who had not experienced them. How could the average civilian comprehend what it meant to fight floor by floor through burning buildings, to watch comrades disintegrated by shell fire, to execute teenagers too fanatical to surrender, to face the moral compromises necessary for survival. Soviet veteran Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, who had commanded the defense of Stalingrad before leading the 8th Guards Army into Berlin, reflected in his memoirs, "The battle changed us all. We entered as soldiers, we left as something else. Some became more human, seeing the enemy suffer as we had suffered, and finding compassion. Others became less human, the killing having consumed whatever humanity they once possessed. None remained the same." On the German side, the psychological impact was even more profound. Those who had been raised in the Nazi system faced not just military defeat, but the complete repudiation of their worldview. Everything they had been taught about German destiny, racial superiority, and the invincibility of the Wehrmacht had proven catastrophically false. This ideological collapse, coupled with the physical destruction around them, created a profound disorientation that some never overcame. Traudl Junge, Hitler's young secretary, who took down his final testament in the bunker, later wrote, "It was as if we awoke from a hypnotic trance. The spell was broken, and suddenly we could see clearly what had always been before our eyes. The crimes, the inhumanity, the lies, they had not been hidden. We had chosen not to see them. This was the most painful realization, that our blindness had been willful, our complicity chosen." For much of the Cold War, the full history of Berlin's fall remained fragmented along ideological lines. Soviet accounts emphasized the heroism of Red Army soldiers and the liberation of Europe from fascism, while minimizing the darker aspects of the conquest. Western accounts often focused on the last days in Hitler's bunker, finding a morbid fascination in the regime's final moments, while giving less attention to the broader battle. German accounts were divided between East and West, each shaped by the political requirements of their respective states. Only after the Cold War ended could a more complete and nuanced understanding of the battle emerge. The opening of Soviet archives revealed previously unknown details about the military operation. East German records became accessible, providing new perspectives on civilian experiences. Witnesses who had remained silent for decades found voices in a unified Germany that was finally ready to confront all aspects of its past. In modern Berlin, reminders of those final battle days exist alongside the gleaming architecture of Europe's most dynamic 21st century city. Bullet holes still pockmark some buildings. Unexploded ordnance continues to be discovered during construction projects. The Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park, featuring a massive statue of a Soviet soldier holding a German child while standing over a broken swastika, remains one of the city's most dramatic monuments, a statement in stone of how the USSR wished the battle to be remembered. The ultimate meaning of Berlin's fall has been interpreted differently across time and political divides. For the Soviet Union, it represented the vindication of communist strength and sacrifice. For the Western Allies, it marked the necessary defeat of Nazism, but also the troubling advance of a new totalitarian power. For Germans, it has variously been seen as just punishment, national tragedy, liberation, or simply the inescapable consequence of the path their nation had chosen in 1933. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Battle of Berlin is its role in cementing the understanding that total war brings total destruction. The battle demonstrated the ultimate futility of Hitler's strategy of victory or annihilation. When political leadership chooses annihilation over compromise, it is civilians who pay the heaviest price. Berlin in 1945 became a case study in the consequences of ideological extremism taken to its logical conclusion. The battle's final act played out on May 9th, when the unconditional surrender of all German forces took effect. In the still smoking ruins of Berlin, surviving residents emerged to face an uncertain future in a divided city. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman wrote, "The great city lies in ruins, but something new stirs amidst the destruction. Among the women clearing rubble, the children playing in bomb craters, the old men planting vegetable gardens in parks, there is life reasserting itself." History has turned a page. The story that begins today remains to be written. That new story would include Berlin's division by the Wall, its role as a flashpoint of Cold War tensions, the peaceful revolution of 1989, German reunification, and Berlin's reemergence as the capital of a democratic, united Germany. Few cities have experienced such dramatic historical reversals within a single century. From imperial capital to Nazi headquarters, from divided city to symbol of European unity. Each transformation has been built upon the ruins left by those fateful weeks in April and May 1945. The Battle of Berlin represents not just a military engagement, but a pivotal moment in European civilization, the violent end of one historical epoch and the blood-soaked beginning of another. It demonstrated both humanity's capacity for self-destruction and its resilience in the face of catastrophe. The city that rose from the rubble stands as testament to this resilience, a place where history's darkest chapter has been neither forgotten nor allowed to define the future. For the soldiers who fought street by street, building by building, room by room, both German and Soviet, the battle's true nature can never be fully captured in historical accounts. The terror, the exhaustion, the momentary acts of mercy amid overwhelming cruelty, the smell of burning buildings and decomposing bodies, the constant thunder of artillery that caused nosebleeds and shattered eardrums. These sensory realities belong only to those who experienced them. Yet, through their testimonies, through the physical evidence that remains, and through the continued work of historians who piece together this complex puzzle, we can approach a deeper understanding of what happened when an irresistible force met a crumbling object, when an army fueled by vengeance encountered a population facing the consequences of their nation's actions, when the abstract concepts of victory and defeat were translated into the concrete realities of human suffering. The story of Berlin's fall is ultimately a human story, millions of individual experiences that collectively constitute one of history's most significant events. It is the story of ideological madness and its consequences. It is the story of ordinary people caught in the machinery of total war. It is the story of a nation's descent from megalomaniacal ambition to utter defeat. And it is the story of how, from complete destruction, recovery and renewal remain possible. As the last eyewitnesses to the Battle of Berlin reach the end of their lives, the responsibility for remembering and understanding passes to new generations. The physical scars on the city have largely healed. The psychological scars have faded, but not disappeared entirely. The battle now exists primarily in cultural memory, in monuments, museums, films, books, and the collective consciousness of a city and nation that has worked to ensure that the darkest chapters of its past inform rather than determine its future. In the heart of modern Berlin stands the Reichstag, its restored glass dome symbolizing the transparency of democratic governance that replaced the regime crushed in 1945. Visitors can still see Soviet graffiti preserved on interior walls, the victors' markings left by soldiers who fought their way into this symbolic center of German power. These inscriptions remain as tangible connections to those final battle days, reminders of how completely one world ended and another began in the spring of 1945. The battle for Berlin teaches us that the foundations of civilization are more fragile than we might wish to believe, that ideologies of hatred and supremacy lead inevitably to destruction, and that the path back from such destruction requires both remembrance and renewal. These lessons, purchased at an unimaginable cost in human suffering, remain relevant in a world where the forces that led to Berlin's fall, nationalism, authoritarianism, militarism, and racial hatred, have not disappeared, but merely evolved. As we contemplate the smoldering ruins of Berlin in May 1945, we are reminded that history's arc is neither predetermined nor necessarily benevolent. It is shaped by human choices, both collective and individual. The Battle of Berlin represents the culmination of choices made over many years, by leaders and ordinary citizens, by perpetrators and victims, by those who resisted evil and those who embraced or accommodated it. Understanding these choices and their consequences is essential for navigating our own historical moment. In the final analysis, the Battle of Berlin stands as one of history's most consequential urban conflicts. The violent death of a regime that had brought unprecedented destruction to Europe and the traumatic birth of a new geopolitical reality that would shape the remainder of the 20th century. Its echoes continue to reverberate in our world, reminding us of both the depths of human capacity for evil and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of utter devastation.